good morning to those of you in the room. Good morning to those of you joining online to a session today called Climate, Conflict, and Community, Strategies for Addressing Climate in Prevention, Reintegration, and Peacebuilding Efforts. I'm going to take a few minutes just to introduce today's session. Also to remind you that if you do want to ask a question or offer a comment when we get to that section of the session, please make sure that you use your microphone. And if you're sitting in the back, please come up and borrow a microphone. My name is Siobhan O'Neill, and I lead the Managing Exits from Armed Conflict initiative at UNIDIR, which is an all-of-UN effort to understand how and why people get involved in armed groups and how and why they leave and sustainably reintegrate into civilian life. I should say right up front that I am not a climate scientist, and this was not designed as a climate security project. But since early 2020, we've been operating in 6 countries: Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, Niger, Colombia, and Iraq. And in every country where we work, climate change is part of the story as to why people are getting involved in conflict, and it is impacting how and when they leave and if they stay out and away from the battlefield. So we come at this very much from the lived experience of the people that we work with and talk to. We do longitudinal multi-method research, and we follow people who have come out of armed groups for years, thousands of them, plus their unaffiliated peers in the community and the communities that receive them once they come home. All of this with the goal of informing policy and practice so that our interventions are evidence-based and more effective at preventing and responding to conflict. As I mentioned, in every location where we work, we see the impact of climate change and the intersectionality between climate change, government weakness or state absence and mismanagement and insecurity coming together to impact conflict dynamics. So in Iraq, I'm sure many of you have seen reporting by others about how ISIL exploited the drought in Sunni farming lands to recruit, and how they had higher recruitment rates from places impacted by drought. We see that in our data. When we ask people if they know anyone affected by climate change in agriculture, of those that do, 29% in Tal Afar knew someone who joined an armed group as a result of these challenges. 29%. And it's not just ISIL, it's militia groups as well. In Colombia, we see FARC dissident groups who are engaged in deforestation, which has implications for climate change, and we see this sort of cycle where they engage in it more as the climate is changing. So this is an El Nino year, it's a drought year. They have been engaging in deforestation activities at a much higher rate than before, which has implications for local communities, their ability to support themselves, and it makes recruitment unfortunately, a more attractive option when there aren't many other economic options. In northwest Nigeria, we see the connection with banditry between sort of the desertification, the shifting farming herding patterns, and how that brings conflict and has evolved with time, is not synonymous with banditry, but how it has contributed, plus the border closure with Niger and economic factors have all contributed to this rise of large-scale criminal violence, which really is its sort of own phenomenon. So we see this everywhere we work. I think we have a unique evidence base that we wanted to use today as the jumping off point to a broader discussion with all of you about what can be done to address these dynamics. And I'm really pleased to be joined with my 2 local research partner colleagues here today. Muhammad Bukhar, who is the founding director of Bukhar Consultancy, which is a multi-method research firm and our local implementing partner based in Maiduguri. and also Dr. Ramaji Hoinathi, who is a senior researcher with ISS, who now leads both the Great Lakes team and the Lake Chad Basin research teams for ISS, and has been our longtime partner both there and also with CRASH, a social science and anthropology research firm based in Jemena. So I'm very excited for them to be able to tell you a little bit more about some of the evidence that we've generated together and separately in this space to kind of contribute to this conversation. Before I ask them about what other people have told them about climate change and conflict, I want to ask them each about their own experience, because both Mohammed and Ramaji actually had come from farming backgrounds. So they've experienced climate change themselves in their own livelihoods. So maybe, Mohammed, I'll start with you, and if you could share a little bit about how a changing climate over time has impacted your and your family's ability to farm.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. Thank you very much for being here. On the personal note, I will start by mentioning the fact that I used to be a small-scale irrigation farmer, and I planted rice, but that was before the conflict in the region started, the Boko Haram insurgency. But even before the conflict started, people have started living this particular practice, because people who could afford better resources, afford to pay more to rent fertile land, had started moving in. And this in turn was the result of people living regular rainy season farming, and they were living due to shifts in weather conditions. The predictability of the rainy season, for example, became quite problematic, and this forced people to move into irrigation farming, and this was already forcing people like me out of that particular practice. And another reason that people were leaving was because much of that particular practice depends on being able to predict the water levels, when water will be available for a particular type of crop, for example. And that was becoming harder and harder to predict. I learned farming from my father, who in turn did from his parents, and that particular sort of knowledge, knowing what to plant and when to do it, was passed from generation across generations. And the climatic changes were creating a particular challenge for people to continue using that knowledge, because people are now being forced to adapt to cultivating new crops, for example, because the older crops weren't doing very good. And the circumstances under which they were doing well is drastically being changed. This in turn also has consequences. The first one is, and I will highlight that by telling a story. While I was in primary school, that was years ago, beans as a crop that was planted at the end of the rainy season was replaced by watermelon, for example. But normally, farmers and herders live together and use the same lands. And when farmers harvest, herders will now bring in their livestock. However, planting watermelon means leaving the crop in the field for much later than is usual. And that ended up creating a conflict, sometimes very violent conflict between farmers and herders. Planting new crop also requires a kind of a learning curve, which most people cannot afford. It means people need to take care of their families. People need to eat. They cannot just put that aside and go and learn new practices. That leaves people extremely vulnerable to being recruited into violent groups, for example, like Boko Haram, for example. I guess that's all I could say on that. Back to you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Ramaje, I want to ask you the same thing because you've dealt with this, but in a different part of the region.
Yes, thank you, Shoban, and good morning to everybody. Yes, I mean, contrary to Mohammed, I'm not living or I'm not originated from the Lake Chad shores, but rather from southern Chad. And in that country, it's considered the most agricultural part of the country. So I also grew up in a farmer's family. And even though most of us work actually in towns, we keep, practicing this activity. So in August 2021, I decided to restart, a field and about a small land and decide to crop maize. And in the same year, we got floodings. So my whole field was underwater and the maize was just rot. So the next season, my cousin was to call me and ask me, are we not restarting? People are starting, so where are you? And I told him, no, I'm not going back. And he, with a smile, told me, that's all about our lives actually. Agriculture now is like this. Sometimes you win and most of the time you lose. But I mean, this is the way we live here. And Mohammed have been talking about predictability, and the inverse of that word is actually what characterizes agriculture in southern Chad, meaning uncertainty. And this is the key word, because you cannot know how to start sowing. You cannot know which kind of crop is adapted for the season coming. You can even not know what will happen to what you have cropped. I mean, would it dry out? Would it rot because there will be floodings? And this is a kind of disaster that people are facing any single rainy season. And in zones where there's no possibility doing irrigation, like my place, then people just have one rainy season. And if this is linked to a lot of uncertainty, it means that living, it's kind of a lotto. You can win, you can lose, but most of the time, people lost. And when you talk about climate change, you talk about also limitation in terms of animal husbandry areas. And so more fighting between the two communities, bringing more tensions. So I would end up here saying that in uncertainty, it's really what people in that zone, my family, and all the others are actually facing.
Thank you both. And I think these personal reflections and experience kind of give you a baseline for understanding what's happening more broadly in the region. And I think that's a great jumping off point because Mohammed and our colleague Kato Vemberkoven and your teams have led a lot of interviews, thousands of interviews with people coming out of JAS and ISWAP factions of Boko Haram. And you've heard these stories, and we have large-scale data to suggest there is some sort of indirect relationship through livelihood challenges. And maybe you can kind of walk us through some of the evidence that you had and the role that it's playing in people's involvement with armed actors in the region.
I will say in general, people do not have a very clear understanding of climate change as a concept. But its impact, it's been felt and acknowledged. As I mentioned before, the erratic nature in recent years of the rainy season, for example, the levels of water in rivers, for example, these are seen and felt and acknowledged. In the research project, as Shoban mentioned, a third of the people the respondents we spoke to reported facing difficulties due to climatic changes. And 11% of people who had previously been with Boko Haram and had reported those difficulties mentioned those difficulties as one of the reasons they joined the group in the first place. These challenges is felt these difficulties is felt all across the region, but how it is felt, the specifics of those stories, they vary from person to person. And I would like to, if I may, read a couple of quotes from some of our respondents that demonstrates what I'm trying to convey here. So the first one from a man who said, my farm was affected by the flooding, or by flooding. Before the insurgency, I was farming in the hills of Goza in Borno State. And Borno State is in the northern part of Nigeria, northeastern part, to be precise. He continues, when Boko Haram members occupied my community, they built their bases on the mountain, and that stopped me from having access to good farmland. Heavy rainfall and flooding made it impossible to farm on the lands available to us. To be able to access good land, one had to join them. This was from one story from one person. But another man also said, I had no choice. The crops I planted were spoiled due to lack of enough rainfall. And it did not yield anything. My livestock was dying because there was no grass for them to feed on and no water in the rivers for them to drink. My health was also deteriorating because I wasn't able to get enough food to eat due to all these issues. That was why I joined the group. And I mentioned these two stories because, yes, it's impacting them, but people have unique stories depending on where they are and how climatic challenges are affecting them.
I think that's really helpful because even when we talk about sort of the intermediary issue of climate change related livelihood loss, the stories and the actual mechanisms can be really varied. And that's only one of those kind of intervening causal relationships that we're looking at. There's displacement. There's conflict over scarce resources. So this can work in so many different ways, but I think this is some of the emerging evidence in this space. And it also shows that not only are people being driven into groups like JAS or ISWAP, but they're also joining self-defense militias as well, because again, people are looking for livelihoods, replacement. I just want to say, we won't have time to dwell on it, but you mentioned the flooding story that we heard, and Mohammed's just come from Maiduguri, which has suffered massive flooding, not only in part because of large rainfalls, which again could be a sign of climate change, but also due to perhaps management issues with the dam. And so I think this gets us into a bunch of other issues too, which is sort of how states are responding to these issues in real time and what impact that has. And I think that's a good transition to turn to you, Ramaji, and to think about people coming out of armed groups and the communities they come to. And I know you and also our colleagues Chitra Nagarajan and Francesca Bateau have done a lot of work in Chad and Cameroon lately, looking at people coming back after time with an armed group, trying to reestablish themselves in the community, and climate is having an impact on their capacity to do so and the capacity of communities to integrate them. So maybe you could offer a couple of reflections on what you've seen in that space.
Yes, sure. I mean, we should maybe start, by considering what is the Lake Chad, as a place for people living around. Because the lake is actually at the intersection of the Sahel and the Sahara zone, meaning it's a reserve of water almost amid a desert. So it's a kind of, before the conflict, it was already a kind of climate refuge where people had, on the shores and also on the islands, and they could keep on farming and raising livestock and also fishing. And what happened actually with the conflict is while people are obliged to go deep in the water, for farming, agriculture, and fishery, the world space have been infested by Boko Haram. So you have here this strong intersection between insecurity and climate change. And so for the communities there, it means that there is a lot of limitations, accessing farming space, fishery, and also animal husbandry spaces. And it's then within those communities that you have to accommodate, people that are leaving Boko Haram. So they get out of Boko Haram first with a social history that's complicated, a lot of stigma, etc. But the most thing is that they get out of Boko Haram, empty-handed, and they are more vulnerable again than the communities that have been, surviving from this conflict. It means for them to be able to fish and to practice agriculture, etc., they depend totally on the communities in terms of having land, having equipment, etc. So you have side by side two levels of misery that are supposed to accommodate one each other. And it's a situation that actually it's very difficult. And when you add to that also the fact that forced displacement actually is creating a lot of conflict of land, of a pasture, etc., then you have a very complicated image of the situation over there. And what is making this situation even more complicated is the response from the states in terms of which kind of policy is in place, to accommodate those people that are getting out of Boko Haram. It's also another question. And as long as those policies are not effective in terms of responding to host communities' needs and accommodating those coming out of Boko Haram, then we have a situation that is really complicated. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I want a quick follow-up to both of you. And, on both sides, both pathways in and pathways out of armed groups, I want to ask you if you've seen anything that's sort of gender-specific. Are the realities for women and girls different, either sort of in their efforts to come home after time with the group or on recruitment? So maybe I'll offer each of you a quick second just to jump in with any evidence you've seen on that.
I will just quickly mention something as an example. Girls and women versus men and boys, when it comes to farming, it's often the practice that they will plant a particular type of crop. So for example, this particular type of crop is mostly women planting it, and this particular one, it's usually men planting it. At the height of the conflict, at some point, the government security forces instituted a policy of banning certain crops from being planted. So if a particular crop reaches a certain height before it reaches maturity, that will be banned because it's considered a security threat, or it makes it difficult to fight the insurgents. This forced men to plant certain crops that are traditionally being planted by men. And in the communities in the Northeast, when that happens, this is usually associated with shame, because men feel like they are now being forced into something that they don't traditionally consider to be their roles. I'm mentioning this because this limits the choices for people even further, because in addition to being limited by climatic changes to adapt to new types of crops, as I mentioned earlier, this is another added layer to the issue that further complicates it and further, as I said, limits the options that are open to them.
Thank you, Mohammed. Ramaji, how about you?
Yes, I maybe follow the same line than Mohammed, but let us consider even before the conflict, social structuration around the Lake Chad Basin. It's very structured in terms of distributing roles and positions and privilege, to people within the society in terms of age, in terms of sex. And then it means that the situation for women and girls, even before the conflict, is a peculiar one in terms of accessing means of production, accessing land, etc. And when we talk with women that actually live in the host communities, but also women that are living Boko Haram, the question is just if the situation, for men that in that society have some privilege that women don't have is already there, what about girls and women? And because of the conflict, most of the women being in the IDP camps, in the refugee camps, but also those returning from Boko Haram, they are alone. So they should take care of the family. And this social distribution of work make them responsible for looking for food in the bush, looking for firewood in the bush, but also looking for water in some places. And when we talk about insecurity and climate change intersection, it means that those resources actually are far away. And then reaching those resources actually expose them to a lot of kind of danger, mainly kidnapping from Boko Haram groups, but also a lot of violence-based, gender-based violences, including from people that are supposed to protect them, meaning soldiers, but sometimes even humanitarian workers. So, I mean, as Mohammed said, the situation following the way the society is structured actually is more dire for women and girls than the others.
Thank you both. I'm going to have two more questions and then make sure that we turn and save time for the participants in the room to contribute and expand our conversation beyond the Lake Chad Basin. But Mohammed, something you said sparked a question I want to ask you, Ramaji, which is really about sort of the state response. And so how these sort of unintended consequences can kind of play into the security situation or make things even harder for people who are struggling with climate adaptation. So maybe, Ramaji, you can offer some thoughts on sort of how the states in the Lake Chad Basin have responded and maybe implications for that response for addressing security and also climate change.
Yes, for sure. You know, the Lake Chad Basin as a space between four countries is a space that actually is on the merge of all those states, and without a very low state presence and also very low social investment. But then when the conflict happened, actually, there was a bias in understanding what should be done in terms of response. So most of the responses have been very strongly military-based. And also, most of the responses didn't consider the welfare of the communities and their vulnerability to violent extremist groups. And let us take some examples. You know, when the conflict started, Mohammed had been talking about some crops that have been banned, but there also there was a lot of ban on fertilizers. There was bans on the use of some equipments, but also bans in accessing some places for fishing and even agriculture. And this actually impacted very strongly, you know, the communities around the Lake Chad Basin. If you consider a place like Difa in Niger, before the conflict, you know, the cultivating and trading a special crop pepper to Nigeria actually could produce some $10 million yearly. But when you ban then this kind of crop, it means the loss that you have there for people that actually didn't receive any investment from the state. So the responsibility of the state here is that they have not been present, but when they try to be present, then they made it in a way that actually is affecting adversely living conditions and making people more vulnerable to Boko Haram. And as he said, some people, they go to Boko Haram not because they believe in anything, but just as a living strategy, you know, to protect your business, to protect your family, to keep producing, then you have to go there. So I think there is also something very critical about the nature of the responses and the responsibility of the states.
I think that's such a good point, and the data that we've collected is extremely clear. When we ask people who have come out of one of the Boko Haram factions if they would go back, everyone we speak to says they don't want to go back, but if they cannot feed themselves, they will be forced to go back. And food insecurity in the region is absolutely one of the #1 issues, and if it's being exacerbated by the very policies that are meant to address the insurgency, we have an issue. So I think that's a really good point that you've highlighted there. As we're about to turn to everybody else in the room, I wanted to ask each of you maybe to spark this conversation of sort of, there's a lot of challenges you've laid out, a lot of intersectionality, but here's a question, where do we go from here? And there are a lot of proposals in the region or emerging efforts, and I wanted to have you weigh in on maybe something that could be brought to bear to address the challenges in the region, or maybe is already floating around as an idea that could be advantageous. So I'll start with you, Mohammed, if you want to highlight anything.
In that respect, there was this idea to engage former associates of a group called CJTF, or the Civilian Joint Task Force. And this group came into existence as a response to Boko Haram violence over 10 years ago. However, over the years, as the dynamics of the conflict shifted, their roles also did the same. And it didn't do so for the better in many cases. And there was this intention to transition them into something maybe more professional. And this idea of transitioning them into this group that was referred to agro rangers was considered. And the intention was to have this group protect people who farm in rural areas to be able to go and farm, that they will provide the security for people to do so. However, there are potential risks involved with that, as the CJTF as a group is also has been accused in the past of engaging in human rights abuses, and there have been questions of whether empowering them further only means empowering them to carry out those abuses in a more powerful role. But if I think it is properly executed, I think there's a lot of people who are struggling in terms of means of livelihood, and this would really empower people, because that means they will be able to access good fertile land to farm, and I think it will help address the issue of food security that Shoban just mentioned.
Thank you. That's a very practical one, and one that's already floating around. Ramaji, anything that comes to mind about what could be done to address some of these issues?
Yes, I will remain at the more regional level. And for me, the first thing is about the debate on climate change itself in the Lake Chad Basin. You know, there is a very strong insistence on a lake that might be disappearing, while actually what we have, the situation on the ground, is water killing people and water endangering a livelihood. So it's important to maybe shift the debate in terms of, instead of insisting about this lake that officially might disappear, but that is not scientifically disappearing, there is a need to focus on what actually directly is linked to people's livelihood. It's about finding solutions for floodings and the drought. This is very important for me. And there's something that have been said in the earlier panel this morning. It's about, it's a mistake for them understanding that they could be fighting Boko Haram on the military field and leaving aside, the file of climate change, because the vulnerability that actually created Boko Haram has a lot to do with climate change. And so letting it aside and fighting Boko Haram militarily would bring us back, to the same situation in the coming decades. And beyond Boko Haram, the Lake Chad Basin is actually a home to a lot of insecurities. There's big banditry in Nigeria that actually is spreading. It's something that might happen in Chad and also in all the other countries. So there is a need, definitely to consider actually climate change on a practical way as also a security threat that should also be combined in fighting Boko Haram and all other kind of insecurities. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both. I think this deep dive, although brief, at least gets us to some of the issues that are happening in the region. But I think the slide today and the presentation of what's happening in the Horn of Africa, both of these gentlemen turned to me and said, all of these factors are exactly what's happening in the Lake Chad, right? And so I think there's other places where we're seeing very similar dynamics, even though the context is different. And I want to zoom out now and invite all of you to jump in with observations and questions, and maybe to take us to a different region. Nike, I'll have you go first. If everyone can please introduce themselves quickly when they come in to comment or question, that would be very helpful in your affiliation. But let's start with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks also to the speakers. It was very insightful. So thanks for sharing the findings professionally and personally also. My name is Nike Löble. I'm working with the Boko Foundation. It's an NGO based in Berlin working on conflict transformation, and I'm mainly working on projects in Iraq. So that's the different setting now, but we do have some similarities. So I did prepare something, but now I'm inspired by what you said, so I try to cover it all. Just in general, so what we can definitely also observe in terms of similarities in Iraq to what was presented by the two speakers is that climate change impacts the farmers a lot, especially in the south of Iraq, so they are driven then also and displaced to rather urban areas. There's a lot of loss of livelihoods, food insecurity as well. And oftentimes those farmers and families end up in very informal settlements without any access to services, electricity, water, or also job opportunities. And this also at times at least leaves them very vulnerable to illicit economies, to armed groups as well, and to recruitment. We can see then displacement, competition over resources, over services as well between communities, especially between the host communities and the new arrivals, and we can also see that different tribal traditions and also conflict resolution mechanisms does not really support finding a common ground. And this is what led then the Boko Foundation together with a local partner organization in Iraq to integrate these environmental concerns and climate change security risks into our peace-building programming. So we set up a dialogue between the local communities in the urban centers, so more specifically we're talking about Basra, to have the host communities and the new arrivals sitting together and finding a certain understanding for each other. And this is, I think, where also I think the importance of the research comes in, because it really helped to find a common ground between the communities to understand what exactly led to the displacement and to understand how climate change and the loss of livelihoods plays like a factor in this conflict setting. And then we can also see that when we bring in local authorities, actually, so this is what, when we're touching upon governance ideas or structures or mechanisms, also helps to rebuild trust, not only between the communities, but also between communities and the local authorities to jointly identify some sort of solution, be it in terms of conflict resolution mechanisms, or be it also in terms of climate adaptation, new ideas, tools, mechanisms, to make actually these solutions sustainable and also community-driven, which helps generating the trust, but also helps to find solutions that directly address the very urgent needs of these communities. Then also because you touched upon the different impacts on women and girls and men, I think this was also something that came out of the dialogues, is that both the women from the new arrival communities but also from the host communities, they reported a certain increase of gender-based violence. And having this joint challenge and concern also helped to rebuild the trust between the communities, and also helped to understand that there's really a need to tackle this issue jointly over the conflict lines, so to say. Yeah, I hope this gave some sort of idea what we are doing in Iraq, and happy to get over.
Thank you, and I think that's really helpful because it highlights similar dynamics, but also some really practical steps to integrate into programming to try to address them. I'd like to turn to another colleague. Yes.
Okay, hello. My name is Paul Junot. I'm with UNEP in Haiti. I just want to point out that it's like copy-paste what you all said with what we're experiencing in Haiti. So I just have an observation and then a question. My observation is that in Haiti it's totally the same. Climate change and insecurity and violence are directly linked because there's a rural exodus because of the deterioration of environment and because of climate change impacts. So the young people mostly are leaving the rural areas to go to the city in search of better livelihoods, which they don't find. So they end up in slums, and then they are at risk of being recruited by armed gangs. And now armed gangs recruit young people as young as 10 years old to join them. So this is what is happening in Haiti. So it's clear that any exit strategy, any peace building or disarmament strategy needs to take into account climate change and environment. But now my question is the following. How do you, because these young people have seen atrocious things. They are traumatized. They've been into violence since their young age. So there's a psychological aspect to this disarmament strategy. And what I'm thinking is, how do you compete with the economic influence of armed gangs? How do you make green livelihoods or appealing? How do you make legitimate opportunities appealing to these young people? So you make a real change. How can you provide new role models for them to identify themselves with, so you know that they won't go back into this criminal armed gang environment? And as for gender-specific realities, just a word on that. Interesting, because in Haiti, same thing. A lot of people now are fleeing Port-au-Prince to go back in rural areas because they're fleeing the violence. But we have 700,000 displaced people right now in the country. But most of them are women and children. So they get back in the host communities, and this reality is totally different because they get to you have to build social cohesion, as the colleague from Iraq said, in the host communities to welcome these people going back to the rural areas. And one anecdote that I can say, when we were looking into the conflicts in the host communities, one thing that we had not expected that came out is all these women are going back. And some of the wives do not like it at all these women going back to the communities. So there's this competition going on that we hadn't talked about, which is a form of conflict and can harm social cohesion. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to open up to some more questions. We'll gather a couple and then we can come back. Please introduce yourself and take the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Hector Morales. I'm a senior advisor at Adelphi. And I just wanted to, because what you just said resonated with me a lot with these role models and these dynamics of armed recruitment, because it has a lot to do with sustainable development models and the chances to get access to jobs, to build economies that are more like green, etc. So in Colombia, where I'm from, I made my PhD on understanding the impact of environmental governance on peace building. And I came with some interesting practices where, so there is a transitional justice mechanism in Colombia where they are trying to, as a measure to, as a restorative justice measure, to do like some land restoration projects. And that also enables this way of reconciliation between the victims of the conflict, but also providing livelihoods to the former combatants. And there they still remain within their community because these guerrillas had like a very cohesive group behavior. So they are not like just going into any job in the city, but they want to remain together. And so, for example, there was a group that made rafting in a buffer zone of a protected area that was very pristine. And they basically remained together and make like ecotourism where they could be in a group, but also have these livelihoods. And that's also creating these role models, because there was like a baby boom after the peace agreement. So there's a lot of 7-year-olds right after the peace agreement. And these kids are not seeing like combatants, but they are seeing these people doing sports and doing rafting, and that's what they want to do. So it's like a small. Now there are some struggles in that area because there's still not complete peace in the country, but it's an interesting example.
Hi, good morning, and thanks for the findings. Thanks for the explanations. My name is Andrea. I'm from GSURF. GSURF is a global fund that funds PV projects across the whole world. I think the first point that whatever you describe, we've seen many places, right? We have seen reported in projects in Iraq, in the Sahel, mainly very strong in the Liptako-Guma region, the border areas between Niger, Mali, and Burkina. You have seen, like, even Southeast Asia, like Philippines, some different kind of combination, but kind of similar reports. I think the second point for me is that maybe you need to differentiate between the people who never join for the people who joined and left. For example, when we talk about, for example, role models and attraction and appealing, I think is a lot about the ones who never joined. Because, I mean, in a way, our findings or our experience is that the people who joined and left the groups don't really want to go back unless there is no other option livelihood-wise. So in a way, like, I think when you talk about prevention, you're talking about how we do the role model, how we do the appealing, how you kind of give a pathway before the situation even happens. But when you're talking about the returnee, the people returning to their communities or to other communities, sometimes they don't come back to the same community, right? Because it's a different set of dynamics. And I think in that point, I think one interesting element is the relationship with the host community, right? I think when you say they depend on the host community to do their fishing, to their livelihood, it's true. I mean, and then if you compound the fact that in some cases they commit violence against that particular community or neighborhood communities, you create a situation where why do I even help them, right? So I think what we have seen in a way is that, because I mean, sometimes we see climate as a way to, like, as a cause or like a known direct effect on conflict, violent extremism, and so on. But I think what our colleagues from Colombia just said is important, like climate action maybe as a way to provide benefits for both in terms of bringing, like, this is a method, right? In terms of creating what we call peace benefits or win-win, what we can call about, in terms of people understanding, okay, like you are giving that to the people returning, but also to the host community working together on these particular livelihoods climate projects. And I think it's important to have both at the same time, same program, because one mistake that a lot of programs do sometimes is just, let's focus only on the host community, or let's focus only on the returnees, and then, well, like, people look at the other side and say, why this person is having this support where I don't. So I think just maybe that's like just some considerations. Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Yeah.
Just a quick, sorry, Daniel Norfolk from IOM Somalia. And my colleague Rico Tupaz, we are with the Community Stabilization Unit that now has a kind of large environmental peace building component or portfolio within it. But just to kind of, I wanted to ask here whether you've experienced or witnessed the same sort of thing, and in a way problematize climate modeling and climate adaptive approaches in the context of dwindling aid resources and people sitting in primarily European capitals worried about an influx of people. We've seen in the stabilization sort of frame in Somalia, it often refers to areas where the government takes back territory from Al-Shabaab, and it's almost exclusively rural, and has caused a similar influx into the cities and sort of hyper-urbanization. And the response has been to even people who are taking sort of a climate modeling perspective and saying, well, large tracts of land will be uninhabitable in 20 to 30 years. Agropastoralism in these areas was sort of a dead livelihood in this future scenario. So let's plow as much money as we can into the urban space to make it, increase the absorption capacity, increase city jobs, and boost the institutional capacities of the government in these places because they don't really extend outside the cities. And we see this leading to a logic that maybe would hold in a country where there were credible governance institutions in the periphery, but in a country prone to insurgency where there are not really that many credible governance institutions in the periphery. The credible informal institutions, the legitimate informal institutions, all revolve around livelihoods and natural resource access, distribution, and management in general. And so what we see is by channeling your attention towards cities, you fail to work with the raw material for institution building in the periphery that would be the bulwark against extremism, against armed insurgency. And so that my question is, do you see the same thing, I guess? Over.
Thank you. I'm getting the sign that we only have 5 minutes in our truncated session. So I'm going to take the opportunity and turn back to our panelists, and you can answer any question that you like or follow up on any of the themes that were raised. So maybe, Mohammed, do you want to go first?
If it's okay, just about the similarities. I think I will mention 2 relevant happenings in the Northeast. One is with regard to the exodus of people from rural locations to urban areas. We see that happening in Maiduguri, for example, which is the state capital of Borno State in the northeast of Nigeria. And one, it's due to deteriorating security situation in rural locations, and then due to a recent phenomenon that we call the mass surrenders. It was caused by a disruption within the armed group, and there was a massive movement of people, close to 100,000 people into Maiduguri. But contrary to what you mentioned about concentrating resources in the cities, what's happening is an effort by the government to try and encourage people to go back to their communities. However, there are issues with that because people are now being forced back to locations that their security is not guaranteed. And also you are now sending people back to a position where they are now vulnerable to, again, being recruited into an armed group, which would end up exacerbating the situation. So I'm just mentioning this because both ways there will always be challenges. Yeah.
Thank you, Mohammed. Ramaji, do you want to pick up on any of the questions or themes?
No, very fast, I agree with what Mohammed said. I mean, there is no sensitivity to climate modeling in that space. And in Chad, for example, what might be called cities around the Lake Chad are actually big villages with, in practice, very rural settings. So you have people inside and obliged to go back, as he said, but there was nothing really in terms of projection around that matter. And regarding the question of the attractivity of the violent extremist groups or armed groups in general, I think you're right in saying that we need to be clear about, are we preventing, new people from joining, or are we also working on recidivism, meaning people that actually get out of those groups. But in the Lake Chad Basin, although it's very scarce, there are some people that actually went back to Boko Haram. And for us as research institutions, what's important is the first is research, is understanding the trajectories. And most of the time people ask the question of why people join. But it's beyond why people join. It's not a term, it's a matter of factors, it's rather a matter of dynamics. And it's very important then following the individual's itinerary and understanding it can be the base of reversing the dynamic. So first is understanding. And in the Lake Chad Basin, there actually, after many years, there are some initiatives that in a way addressing this situation. There was this regional stabilization strategy with a lot of components, but there are some components in link with livelihoods. There are also some components on transitional justice, as these have been mentioned, but also another policy that is actually underway is what they called community-based reconciliation. That is, in a way, a policy to encourage, communities' readiness to welcome people that are back, and also reinforcing communities' capability, hosting those people and accepting them. So these are some examples, but importantly, it's rather understanding from the onset the dynamics that lead people to those groups and then reversing it.
Thank you both. Maybe I'll offer just a couple thoughts randomly on some of the themes that were picked up. One, just because it struck me when the question of Haiti, and we're going to have a discussion about how we think about doing this there. But one of the challenges, I think, in the Lake Chad Basin, because we do a lot of work on sort of functioning and psychosocial issues, and those don't manifest in the same way that they do elsewhere, in part because when you are hungry, that is not your main concern, and your body is just so focused on feeding you, and that is the #1 issue for the people we speak to. You have respondents telling you they've eaten rocks recently just to put something in their stomach. So this, for many, they don't even get to that sort of point. On this issue of sort of governance structures, I think the work in the Northwest that we've expanded into really highlights this. And even the local structures, when people are still there and doing that sort of immediate adaptation, they're completely overwhelmed now by the amount of conflict. And so they cannot adapt either, and it creates an opening for armed groups. So I think even if we're talking about displacing them to other sort of structures, even the ones at the local level are not able to respond to the level of friction and conflict that's coming out of some of these crises. And then lastly, just the Colombian example, maybe to pull up one thing there, which is traditionally DDR programs meant to break the social bonds between commander and soldier, and to break those relationships so they couldn't be quickly reformed and restart conflict. But I think the example that you're highlighting in the Colombian case, and examples from Somalia and elsewhere, I think we're rethinking this, and that those relationships can be repurposed. These are trusted relationships. Sometimes they are the only relationships people leave with. They don't have a family or support system to return to. And so can we reimagine those, particularly in these kind of win-win scenarios that you're talking about, that are integrated into communities as a way of addressing collective challenges. And maybe to end on one very, maybe a slightly controversial reflection as we go into lunch, and I hope we'll continue the discussion there, I think one of the things to think about in this space, we often talk more in the counterterrorism or the peacebuilding space about resilience, and resilience is thought of very narrowly. It's resilience against recruitment. But I think we need to remember that recruitment into armed groups in places like the Lake Chad Basin and some of the other contexts that are mentioned, that is a climate adaptation strategy. That is someone trying to survive and provide. And we need to remember those choices and why they're being made if we are serious about trying to intervene at the individual and community level to prevent recruitment, to prevent the rise of these armed actors, and to stop conflicts. Thank you very much for joining us today for this conversation, and I hope we'll continue it over lunch.